how to balance freedom and responsibility for a fulfilling life. All right, let's dive into one of the deepest, most philosophical questions out there. How do we balance freedom and responsibility in a way that leads to a fulfilling life? This may sound abstract, but it's something we all deal with every single day. We all want freedom to make our own choices, to live life on our own terms. But here's the catch: with freedom comes responsibility. And that's where things get tricky. How can we be truly free if we're always held accountable for our actions? How do we find that balance? Today, we're going to explore these questions through the lens of one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre was an existentialist, and he had some wild ideas about freedom. According to Sartre, freedom isn't just about making choices, it's about realizing that we always have a choice. Even in situations where it feels like we have no control, Sartre would argue that we're still free to choose how we respond. But here's the kicker: with this ultimate freedom comes ultimate responsibility. We're not just responsible for ourselves, but for how our choices impact the world around us. So, let's break this down. Sartre believed that every single action we take defines us. There's no escaping it. Every choice we make says something about who we are, and because of that, we can't blame anyone else for the outcomes of our lives. We can't say, well, I didn't have a choice, or I was just following orders. For Sartre, those are excuses. And this is where the balance between freedom and responsibility comes in. We are free to choose, but we're also responsible for what those choices mean for us and for others. Now, this can sound overwhelming, right? The idea that you're completely responsible for everything in your life. But here's where it gets interesting. Sartre didn't see this responsibility as a burden. He saw it as empowering. Because if we're responsible for our lives, that means we have the power to change them. We're not trapped by circumstances, other people's expectations, or even our own past choices. We are radically free. But here's the question: how do we handle that freedom? How do we live with the weight of knowing that every choice matters? This is where practical wisdom comes into play. Sartre didn't just want us to sit around thinking about freedom, he wanted us to live it. And that means making choices with intention, with awareness. It means recognizing that while we are free, our freedom is always tied to responsibility, and responsibility doesn't have to be a bad thing. In fact, it's what gives our freedom meaning.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound spiritual lesson.
Let's think about this in a real-world scenario. Imagine you're at a crossroads in your career. You have the freedom to quit your job and start something new, or stay where you are. Sartre would say, great, you're free to do whatever you want. But here's the catch: you're responsible for the consequences of that decision. If you quit and fail, that's on you. If you stay and feel unfulfilled, that's also on you. There's no one else to blame. But that's not a reason to be paralyzed by indecision. It's a reason to embrace the fact that you get to make this decision. Here's a deep question for you: what would your life look like if you fully accepted responsibility for every choice you make? No excuses, no blaming circumstances or other people, just pure ownership of your decisions. How would that change the way you approach your life? Would it make you more cautious, or would it empower you to take more risks, knowing that you're in control? Embracing radical freedom: how to use Sartre's philosophy to make confident life choices. All right, so we've established that, according to Sartre, we're radically free. We always have a choice, and with that comes the responsibility to face the consequences of those choices. But the real question is, how do we make choices confidently in a world where every decision seems to carry so much weight? Sartre's philosophy isn't just about abstract freedom, it's about how we live authentically, how we embrace that freedom to create a life that's truly our own. Let's think about this. What does it mean to live authentically? For Sartre, authenticity means acknowledging your freedom and taking ownership of your choices, rather than hiding behind excuses or social norms. It's about being true to yourself, but not in some shallow, follow your heart kind of way. It's deeper than that. It's about recognizing that you're the author of your life, and no one else can write your story for you. Here's where things get interesting. Sartre believed that most of us live in what he called bad faith. This happens when we deny our freedom and responsibility by convincing ourselves that we don't have a choice. We tell ourselves things like, I have to stay in this job because I need the money, or I can't pursue my dreams because people would think I'm crazy. According to Sartre, this is a lie. We're pretending we don't have a choice because it's easier than facing the anxiety that comes with freedom. Think about that for a second. How many times in your life have you avoided making a decision because you didn't want to deal with the responsibility that came with it? Maybe you stayed in a relationship that wasn't working because the idea of leaving was too overwhelming. Maybe you stuck with a career path that wasn't fulfilling because it felt safer than starting over. Sartre would say that in those moments you were living in bad faith. You were denying your freedom because it was easier than facing the truth. But here's the catch. Living in bad faith might protect you from short-term discomfort, but it will never lead to long-term fulfillment. Why? Because deep down, you know you're not living authentically. You know you're not making choices that align with who you truly are. And that creates a kind of existential angst, a feeling of being disconnected from yourself and your own potential. So how do we stop living in bad faith and start embracing radical freedom? How do we use Sartre's philosophy to make confident life choices? The first step is to own your freedom. You have to recognize that you're free to choose, even when it feels like you're not. This doesn't mean that your circumstances don't matter, they do. But it means that within those circumstances, you always have some degree of choice. Even if you can't control what happens to you, you can control how you respond to it. And that's where your power lies. Here's a practical example. Let's say you're in a job you hate. You might feel like you have no choice but to stay because you need the money or because you don't know what else to do. But Sartre would challenge you to rethink that. He'd say you do have a choice. You could start looking for a new job, start a side project, or even quit and figure it out along the way. The point isn't that any one choice is the right one. The point is that you get to choose. And once you recognize that, you can start making decisions from a place of empowerment rather than fear. Here's another deep question for you. What's one area of your life where you've been telling yourself you don't have a choice? What would happen if you stopped making excuses and fully embraced the fact that you're free to choose your own path? The second step to embracing radical freedom is to accept that there's no perfect choice. Sartre believed that we live in a world without predetermined meaning. There's no blueprint for how to live a good life. This can be terrifying because it means we can't rely on external rules or guidelines to tell us what to do. But it's also liberating because it means we get to create our own meaning. We get to decide what's important to us and what kind of life we want to live. This is where Sartre's famous phrase comes in: existence precedes essence. In other words, we're not born with a fixed purpose or identity. We create it through our actions. We become who we are through the choices we make. So, when you're faced with a difficult decision, remember that there's no right answer. There's only the answer that you create through your choices. Navigating the anxiety of freedom, how to overcome fear and embrace responsibility. So, we've talked about freedom and responsibility and how Sartre's philosophy invites us to embrace the fact that we always have a choice, But here's the thing, freedom is scary. If we're being honest, the idea that we're radically free to choose, free to shape our lives can be downright terrifying. Why? Because with that freedom comes uncertainty, and with uncertainty comes anxiety. Sartre called this the anxiety of freedom, and if you've ever felt paralyzed by a big decision, you know exactly what he meant. Let's dig into this a little more. Why does freedom make us anxious? It's because, in Sartre's view, when we realize we're free, we also realize that nothing is predetermined. Nobody is going to tell us what to do or how to live our lives. There's no cosmic guidebook or divine script that lays out the right path. We're responsible for creating meaning in our own lives, and that responsibility can feel overwhelming. Every choice we make is like a brushstroke on the canvas of our life, and there's always the fear that we might mess it up. But here's where Sartre gives us an incredible insight. The anxiety that comes with freedom isn't something to avoid, it's something to embrace. Why? Because that anxiety is a sign that we're truly free. It's a sign that we're taking our choices seriously. Sartre would argue that if you're not feeling some level of anxiety about your decisions, you're probably not fully aware of your freedom, or worse, you're living in bad faith by trying to deny it. Think about it. When was the last time you faced a decision and felt that pit in your stomach, that nervous energy that comes with knowing the stakes are high? Maybe it was choosing a career, deciding whether to stay in a relationship, or figuring out where to live. That anxiety is a signal that you're at a crossroads. And instead of running from it, Sartre would encourage you to lean into it. Because here's the truth: you can't escape the responsibility of your choices, but you can choose how you respond to that responsibility. So, how do we overcome the fear that comes with freedom? How do we make decisions without being paralyzed by anxiety? The first step is to accept the uncertainty. Sartre reminds us that life is uncertain by nature. There's no way to predict the future, no way to know for sure how things will turn out. And that's okay. The anxiety we feel about making choices is often rooted in a fear of the unknown. We don't want to make a mistake or take the wrong path. But Sartre's philosophy gives us permission to let go of the idea that there's a right path to begin with. Instead of worrying about making the perfect decision, we can focus on making the most authentic decision, the one that aligns with who we are and what we value in the moment. Here's a powerful question to ask yourself: what's more important to you, making the right choice or making a choice that reflects your true self? When you reframe your decisions in terms of authenticity rather than perfection, the anxiety starts to melt away. It's no longer about choosing the correct option according to some external standard, it's about choosing what feels right for you. The second step is to take responsibility for your choices fully and completely. This doesn't mean beating yourself up if things don't go as planned. It means owning the fact that you're the one steering the ship. Sartre believed that when we take full responsibility for our choices, we gain a sense of empowerment. Yes, it's scary to know that there's no one else to blame if things go wrong, but it's also incredibly freeing to know that you have the power to shape your life in a meaningful way. Think about it this way: what would change in your life if you stopped blaming your circumstances or other people for where you are right now? What if you took full responsibility for your situation, whether it's good or bad? When you do that, you stop feeling like a victim of life and start realizing that you're the author of your own story. The final step is to act despite the fear. Freedom will always come with a degree of anxiety that's part of the deal. But Sartre would tell us that the worst thing we can do is let that anxiety stop us from acting. The only way to truly live in freedom is to make choices, even when they feel overwhelming. The more you practice making decisions that align with your authentic self, the more comfortable you'll become with the anxiety that comes with freedom. Here's a challenge for you. Think of a decision you've been putting off because it feels too difficult or uncertain. What would happen if you just made the choice today? Not because you know exactly how it will turn out, but because you trust yourself to handle whatever comes next. That's what Sartre's philosophy is all about, not avoiding the anxiety of freedom, but embracing it as a sign that you're living authentically. Living a fulfilling life, how freedom and responsibility lead to meaning and purpose. So, how do we translate all of this freedom, responsibility, and the anxiety that comes with them into a fulfilling life? Sartre believed that the key to a meaningful existence isn't found in some external source of validation or a preordained destiny. Instead, it's found in how we live our freedom and take ownership of our choices. In essence, meaning is something we create through the way we engage with our freedom and accept our responsibility. Let's break this down. A fulfilling life, according to Sartre, comes from living authentically. And authenticity is about making choices that reflect who we are, not based on what society expects, what others want, or even what we think we should do. It's about owning our freedom and recognizing that every decision is an opportunity to express our true selves. When we make choices that align with our values, we create a life that feels purposeful, even in the face of uncertainty. But here's the thing, living authentically isn't always easy. It requires courage because it often means going against the grain, taking risks, and embracing the fact that there are no guarantees. It means making choices that might not make sense to others or that might even scare us. But Sartre would argue that this is the only way to live a life that's truly our own. Here's a deep question to consider. Are you living a life that reflects your true self, or are you living according to someone else's script? This is the fundamental question Sartre asks us to confront. If we're living in bad faith, denying our freedom by following a path laid out by others, we'll never experience the fulfillment that comes from living authentically. But when we take responsibility for our choices, even the hard ones, we start to create a life that feels meaningful. Now, let's talk about responsibility. We've already established that with freedom comes responsibility. But here's the thing, responsibility is what gives our freedom depth. Without responsibility, freedom is empty. It's just the ability to do whatever we want, with no sense of consequence or meaning. But when we accept responsibility for our choices, our actions start to matter. We realize that our decisions have an impact, not just on ourselves, but on the people around us and the world we live in. Think about it. How would your life change if you fully embraced the responsibility that comes with your freedom? What if, instead of seeing responsibility as a burden, you saw it as a way to give your life meaning? Every choice you make becomes an opportunity to shape the world, to contribute to something larger than yourself. This is where Sartre's philosophy becomes deeply practical. It's not just about abstract freedom, it's about the real, tangible choices we make every day and how those choices define us. In the end, a fulfilling life is one where we embrace both our freedom and our responsibility. It's a life where we face the anxiety of freedom head-on, knowing that it's a sign we're alive, that we're engaged with the world. And it's a life where we take ownership of our choices, knowing that they are the building blocks of our identity and our legacy. So, here's the final question I'll leave you with. What kind of life do you want to create with your freedom? The answer is yours to decide. But remember, as Sartre would say, you are condemned to be free. And that, my friends, is both the greatest challenge and the greatest gift of being human. Thank you for watching, and remember, the life you live is the life you choose.